Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is marry a stranger to save her family. Sometimes the loneliest thing a man can do is wait his whole life for someone strong enough to stand beside him. Beau Rawlins is a giant of a cowboy who built his ranch with his own hands. He's turned away every woman who wanted to marry him because he needs more than pretty. When Annabeth Lane steps off the stagecoach, she's got fine manners and a desperate heart. He tells her straight what he wants in a wife. But can this Eastern lady prove she's got the fight he's looking for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Copper Creek. It hung in the air like memories, coating everything with a fine layer of grit that reminded folks this was hard country for hard people. The town sat in a valley carved between two ridges of red rock, where the wind came down fierce in winter and the sun beat merciless in summer. It was the kind of place that either made you stronger or broke you clean in half. Beau Rawlins had been made stronger. At 34, he stood 6 feet 6 inches in his stocking feet, with shoulders broad enough that he had to turn sideways to walk through most door frames. His hands were the size of dinner plates, scarred from barbed wire and brandings, calloused from 15 years of building something from nothing. When he walked down Main Street, which wasn't often, conversations stopped. Not because folks feared him, though some did, but because he commanded the kind of respect that came from seeing a man pull himself up by his bootstraps and then keep pulling until he owned half the valley. The Rollins spread stretched from Copper Creek all the way to Devil's Canyon, 10,000 acres of prime grazing land that Beau had assembled one hard-fought piece at a time. He'd started with nothing but the clothes on his back and a rusted branding iron that had belonged to his father. That iron sat now in the place of honor above his fireplace, a reminder of where he'd come from and what he'd lost. Thomas Rollins had died at Gettysburg when Beau was 19, leaving behind a son who carried his daddy's stubborn streak and his mama's keen intelligence. Mary Rollins had passed the winter after. Some said from a broken heart, others from the influenza that swept through the territory that year. Either way, Beau had buried both parents before his 20th birthday and decided he was done with losing people he loved. The war had taken him next. 4 years in blue wool, fighting through Virginia and Georgia, watching boys from his unit fall like wheat before the scythe. He'd come home with a scar across his ribs from a Confederate saber and another across his soul that ran deeper. Some men came back from war eager to settle down, to find a soft woman and make babies and forget the sound of cannon fire. Beau came back, wanting only to build something that couldn't be taken away. He'd worked cattle drives for 3 years, saving every penny, sleeping under stars and eating beans from a can. When old Henrik Morrison decided to sell his spread and move back east to live with his daughter, Beau had been ready with cash money. The ranch house was barely more than a cabin then, 4 rooms and a leaky roof, but it sat on good water, with grass that grew thick and sweet. That was 15 years ago. Now the Rollins place was the finest spread in 3 counties, with a house built of solid timber and local stone, big enough for a family that might have been. The barn could hold 100 head of cattle through the worst winter, and the bunkhouse accommodated 8 hands year-round. Beau ran 3,000 head of cattle and owned the finest breeding bull this side of Denver. What he didn't have was a wife. It wasn't for lack of trying on the part of every marriageable woman in Copper Creek and beyond. There was Sarah Henderson, the banker's daughter, who could play piano and spoke a little French. There was Mary Catherine O'Sullivan, whose father owned the largest general store in town and who could cook a Sunday dinner that would make a man weep. There was even Violet Prescott, who'd come out from St. Louis with her aunt and had more book learning than most men. Beau had courted them all in his fashion. He was polite, brought flowers when it seemed expected, sat through church socials and town dances. But when each of them had looked at him with soft eyes and softer expectations, when they'd spoken of quiet homes and gentle children, he'd felt something close to panic rise in his chest. They wanted a tame man, a man who would come home each evening to sit by the fire and read scripture while his wife did needlework. They wanted someone who would be grateful for their accomplishments in watercolors and piano, who would nod approvingly when they discussed the latest fashions from back east. Beau needed something else entirely. The frontier was no place for soft women. He'd seen too many pioneers' wives broken by the isolation, the harsh weather, the constant threat of Indian raids or cattle rustlers. He'd watched gentle women wither under the endless work of keeping house without servants, of raising children without doctors nearby, of standing beside their men when times got desperate. He needed a partner, not a pet. Someone who could work beside him when the cattle were calving in a blizzard, who could shoot straight if trouble came calling, who could look at 10,000 acres of hard country and see the beauty in it instead of just the difficulty. He needed a woman who understood that love on the frontier wasn't about poetry and pressed flowers. It was about standing back to back when the world tried to knock you down. The problem was, that kind of woman seemed as rare as rain in August. So Beau had done what practical men did when conventional solutions failed. He'd placed an advertisement in the Eastern newspapers, looking for a bride who understood exactly what she was signing up for. He'd been honest in his requirements: strong constitution, willingness to work, no romantic notions about frontier life. In return, he offered security, protection, and a partnership that would last as long as they both drew breath. The responses had been disappointing. Most were from women who seemed to think marriage to a wealthy rancher meant a life of leisure, waited on by servants and spending their days in idle pursuits. A few had been clearly desperate, willing to say anything to escape their circumstances back east. Only one letter had shown promise. Miss Annabeth Lane of Philadelphia had written in a clear, educated hand about the failure of her family's business and her need to secure her future through marriage. She made no claims about love or romantic attachment, but spoke instead of hard work, loyalty, and mutual respect. She was 26, past the first bloom of youth, but not yet considered an old maid. She could read and write, had helped manage her father's accounts, and understood that frontier life required sacrifices. Most importantly, she had asked practical questions. What were his expectations for household management? How isolated was the ranch? What provisions would be made for medical emergencies? These weren't the questions of a woman with romantic fantasies about cowboy heroes and sunset rides. Beau had written back with equal practicality. He'd enclosed money for train fare and told her to arrive in Copper Creek by the 1st of October. If they found each other suitable, they would marry immediately. If not, he would pay her return passage and a small sum for her trouble. It was, he thought, a reasonable arrangement between two adults who understood the realities of life. Now, as he stood on the platform of Copper Creek's small train station, watching the afternoon eastbound pull away in a cloud of steam and cinders, Beau wondered if he'd made a mistake. The woman who stepped down onto the weathered planks looked nothing like what he'd expected. Annabeth Lane was small, barely reaching his chest even in her traveling boots. Her dress was fine wool in deep blue, with more buttons and ribbons than seemed practical. Her hair was the color of honey, pinned up in an elaborate arrangement that had probably taken her maid an hour to perfect. She wore gloves that had never seen honest work and carried herself with the careful posture of someone who'd been taught to walk with books balanced on her head. She looked, in other words, like exactly the kind of soft, refined lady he'd spent years avoiding. But when she turned those green eyes up to meet his gaze, Beau saw something that made him pause. There was steel beneath the silk, a backbone that might bend but wouldn't break. She looked at him without flinching, taking in his size and rough appearance with the calculating assessment of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly. "Mr. Rollins, I presume," she said, her voice carrying the crisp vowels of good Eastern education, but none of the breathless flutter he'd expected. "Miss Lane," he touched the brim of his hat. "I hope your journey wasn't too taxing." 3 days on a train is always taxing, Mr. Rollins, but I've survived worse." She gestured to a modest trunk and carpet bag beside the platform. "I travel light, as requested." Beau hefted her trunk as easily as if it were a sack of feed, noting that she'd been true to her word. No steamer trunks full of ball gowns and party shoes, no hat boxes or cases of jewelry. Just the basics a practical woman would need to start a new life. As he loaded her belongings into his wagon, Annabeth stood beside him in silence, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She didn't chatter nervously or exclaim over the scenery. She simply waited, watching the town with the same assessing gaze she'd turned on him. "It's not much to look at," Beau said, suddenly seeing Copper Creek through her eyes. The dusty main street with its handful of businesses, the adobe church with its bell tower, the scatter of houses that made up the residential area. After Philadelphia, it must seem like the edge of civilization. "I didn't come here for the scenery, Mr. Rollins." Annabeth accepted his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat, her grip firmer than he'd expected. "I came here to build a life. Sometimes the best foundations are laid in unremarkable places." As they drove through town toward his ranch, Beau found himself stealing glances at his intended bride. She sat straight back beside him, her hands steady on her reticule, her gaze taking in everything they passed. When they encountered other townspeople, she nodded politely, but didn't seem to expect or want extended conversation. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it was weighted with unspoken questions. Tomorrow they would stand before Reverend Mackenzie and pledge their lives to each other. Tonight they were still strangers, trying to measure what they'd gotten themselves into. The sun was setting behind the western ridge when they finally turned up the long drive that led to the Rollins place. Beau heard Annabeth's small intake of breath as the house came into view, and he felt a flush of pride despite himself. The house stood solid and imposing against the backdrop of red rock cliffs, its stone foundation and timber walls speaking of permanence and prosperity. Light glowed in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney where his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, was preparing dinner. The barn and outbuildings spread out beyond, neat and well-maintained, while cattle dotted the pastures that stretched as far as the eye could see. "It's beautiful," Annabeth said quietly, and for the first time since stepping off the train, her composed mask slipped just enough to show genuine emotion. "You've built something remarkable here, Mr. Rollins." Beau felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I've worked hard for it," he said simply, "and I expect the same from anyone who shares it with me." She turned to look at him then, those green eyes serious and direct. "I wouldn't have come all this way if I weren't prepared to work, Mr. Rollins. The question is whether you're prepared to let me." The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows of the Copper Creek Hotel, where Annabeth had spent her first night in the territory. She stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting the borrowed veil that Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, had insisted she wear. "Every bride needs a veil, dear," the woman had said, pressing the delicate lace into Annabeth's hands the evening before. "It was my mother's, and her mother's before that. Consider it a welcome gift to our community." The veil felt foreign against her hair, a reminder of traditions and expectations she wasn't sure she could fulfill. In Philadelphia, she had attended weddings where brides glowed with happiness, surrounded by families who had known each other for generations. Here, she was about to marry a man she'd met less than 24 hours ago, in front of people who were still deciding whether to accept her. But the marriage certificate waiting at the church was more than just a piece of paper. It was her salvation, and her gamble rolled into one. With her signature on that document, she would become Mrs. Beau Rawlins, mistress of one of the largest ranches in the territory. Without it, she would be Miss Annabeth Lane, a burden her family could no longer afford to bear. The walk to the church felt longer than it was. Word had spread quickly through Copper Creek that the giant rancher was finally taking a bride, and curious faces peered from windows and doorways as Annabeth made her way down Main Street. She kept her chin up and her pace steady, refusing to show the nervousness that fluttered in her stomach like trapped birds. The church was small but sturdy, built of the same red stone that seemed to define the landscape here. Reverend Mackenzie waited at the altar, a kind-faced man with grey whiskers who had welcomed her warmly the night before. The pews held perhaps 30 people more than Annabeth had expected for a hastily arranged ceremony. Beau stood at the front, wearing what was clearly his best suit, but still looking like a man who belonged outdoors rather than in a church. His massive frame seemed to dwarf the small sanctuary, and when he turned to watch her approach, his expression was unreadable. There was no processional music, no flower girls or elaborate ceremony. Annabeth simply walked down the aisle with measured steps, her hand resting lightly on the arm of Mr. Henderson, who had offered to give her away in the absence of her father. The borrowed veil trailed behind her, its lace catching the morning light that streamed through the church's simple windows. When she reached the altar, Beau stepped forward to take her hand. His palm was warm and rough against her gloved fingers, and she could feel the strength in his grip, even though he was clearly being careful not to hurt her. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mackenzie began, his voice carrying easily through the small space, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Beau Thomas Rawlins and Annabeth Rose Lane in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Annabeth, but her attention was focused on the man beside her. Up close, she could see the small scar that ran along his jawline, probably from some long-ago accident. His hair was darker than it had appeared yesterday, brown with threads of premature silver at the temples. He smelled of soap and leather and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her practical approach to this arrangement. "Do you, Beau Thomas Rawlins, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do." Beau's voice was steady, his eyes never leaving her face. "Do you, Annabeth Rose Lane, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" The words caught in her throat for just a moment. This was at the point of no return. Once she spoke those words, everything would change. Her old life would be gone forever, replaced by something unknown and challenging and possibly wonderful. "I do," she said, her voice clear and firm. The Reverend smiled and opened his mouth to continue with the traditional ceremony, but Beau suddenly stepped closer to Annabeth, his hand tightening on hers. The congregation stirred with curiosity as he looked down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Before we finish this," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church, "I need to say something." Reverend Mackenzie blinked in surprise. "Mr. Rollins, perhaps we should—" "No." Beau's tone was respectful but unyielding. "She needs to hear this now, before she makes her final choice." The church fell completely silent. Annabeth could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on them, but all she could focus on was Beau's face as he turned to address her directly. "Miss Lane, Annabeth, you came here thinking you were marrying a rancher who needed a wife to keep house and bear children. That's what my advertisement said, and that's what I let you believe." His grip on her hands was firm, anchoring, but that's not the whole truth. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Annabeth felt her heart begin to race, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I don't want a lady," Beau continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't want someone who'll sit in the parlor doing needlework while I handle everything else. I don't want a decoration or an ornament or someone who needs protecting from the realities of this life." Sarah Henderson gasped audibly from the third pew. Mrs. O'Sullivan made a small sound of disapproval, but Annabeth found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the passion in his voice. "I want a fighter," Beau said, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "I want someone who'll work beside me when the cattle are dying in a blizzard, who'll stand with me when the bank tries to foreclose, who'll help me build something that'll last long after we're both in the ground. I want a woman who'll cook not because it's expected, but because she understands that feeding your family is an act of love. I want someone who'll bear sons not as a duty, but because she wants to raise strong children who can handle whatever this world throws at them." The silence in the church was so complete that Annabeth could hear her own heartbeat. She was vaguely aware of shocked expressions on the faces around them, of whispered conversations starting and stopping. But all of that faded into background noise as she processed what Beau was telling her. "If that's not what you want," he continued, his voice gentling slightly, "if you came here expecting a comfortable life with a tame husband who let you keep your soft ways, then speak up now. I'll pay your passage back east and no hard feelings. But if you stay, if you say those vows, then you need to understand what you're signing up for." Annabeth stared up at him, her mind racing. Every proper instinct she possessed screamed that she should be scandalized, that she should gather her skirts and march right out of that church. No gentleman spoke to a lady this way, especially not in front of the entire town. Her mother would have had vapors. Her Philadelphia friends would have been appalled. But something deeper than propriety was stirring in her chest, something that had been sleeping for years under layers of good breeding and social expectations. As she looked into Beau's eyes, she saw not disrespect but honesty, not cruelty but hope. He wasn't trying to diminish her, he was challenging her to be more than she'd ever imagined she could be. The borrowed veil suddenly felt less like a symbol of tradition and more like a costume she was ready to discard. The marriage certificate waiting to be signed wasn't just a legal document, it was an invitation to become someone new. "Are you finished, Mr. Rollins?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. He nodded, uncertainty flickering across his features for the first time since she'd met him. "Good." Annabeth stepped closer to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Because I have something to say too." Now, it was Beau's turn to look surprised. The congregation leaned forward collectively, hanging on every word. "I didn't come here to be comfortable, Mr. Rollins. If I wanted comfort, I would have married Preston Matthews back in Philadelphia. He offered me a life of leisure, servants to do the work, and children raised by nannies." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I came here because I want to build something that matters. I want to work for what I have, instead of having it handed to me. And yes, I want to fight for this ranch, for this life, and for the man who's brave enough to ask for a real partner instead of a pretty ornament." The church erupted in whispers and gasps. Mrs. Henderson fanned herself vigorously. Several of the men nodded approvingly, while their wives looked scandalized. "So finished the ceremony, Reverend Mackenzie," Annabeth continued, never taking her eyes off Beau's face. "Because I know exactly what I'm signing up for, and I can't wait to get started." For a moment, Beau's composed mask slipped completely, and Annabeth saw something raw and hopeful in his expression. Then he smiled, not the polite, careful smile he'd shown her yesterday, but something genuine and warm that transformed his entire face. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Reverend Mackenzie said hastily, clearly eager to finish before any more surprises could derail the ceremony, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Beau's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones as he looked down at her. For a heartbeat, the church and the congregation and the whole world fell away, leaving just the two of them suspended in this moment of beginning. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the chaste, ceremonial kisses she'd witnessed at other weddings. It was firm and warm and full of promise, acclaiming that she found herself answering with surprising passion. When they finally broke apart, Annabeth felt breathless and slightly dizzy, as if she'd just committed to something far more dangerous and exhilarating than marriage. The congregation burst into applause, though some of it sounded more uncertain than congratulatory. As Beau tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and they turned to face their new community, Annabeth caught sight of several disapproving faces among the smiling ones. She had the distinct feeling that her real challenges were just beginning. The ride back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence. Annabeth sat beside her new husband on the wagon seat, hyper-aware of his presence beside her and the gold band that now circled her finger. The weight of what they'd both said in the church settled around them like dust from the road. When they arrived at the house, Beau helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her easily to the ground. "Mrs. Chen has prepared the guest room for you," he said, his voice formally polite. "You'll want time to settle in and rest before supper." Annabeth felt a flutter of disappointment that surprised her. After his passionate declaration in church, she'd somehow expected what? That he would sweep her off to his bedroom immediately? The thought made her cheeks warm, and she was grateful for the afternoon shadows that might hide her blush. "That's very considerate," she replied, matching his tone. "I would appreciate the opportunity to change into something more practical." She followed him into the house, her heeled boots clicking on the polished wood floors. The interior was more refined than she'd expected, with solid furniture that showed both quality and masculine taste. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and above it hung the rusty branding iron that had caught her attention the day before. "That was my father's," Beau said, noticing her gaze. "Thomas Rollins. He died at Gettysburg before he could use it to build anything lasting. I've been building in his memory ever since." The simple words carried weight that Annabeth felt in her chest. "He would be proud of what you've accomplished." "I hope so." Beau gestured toward a hallway. "Your room is this way." The guest room was pleasant and comfortable, with a window that looked out over the barn and pastures beyond. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed, and her smaller bag had been placed on the dresser. Someone, presumably the mysterious Mrs. Chen, had laid out fresh towels and left a pitcher of water for washing. "Supper is at 6, Beau said from the doorway. "Mrs. Chen is an excellent cook, but starting tomorrow, the household management will be your responsibility." After he left, Annabeth sank onto the bed and looked around her new domain. The room was comfortable enough, but it felt temporary, a place for a guest, not a wife. She wondered how long she would be sleeping here, and what would determine when that changed. From her smaller bag, she withdrew her most precious possession, the sheet music for Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the last piece her mother had played before the illness took her. The pages were worn from years of handling, and several bore water stains from tears shed in private moments. As she smoothed the papers carefully and placed them in the dresser drawer, Annabeth felt as though she was tucking away the last remnant of her old life. She changed from her wedding dress into a simple grey wool dress, more practical but still refined by frontier standards. When she came down for supper, she found Beau waiting in the dining room, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt. He stood when she entered, a courtesy that spoke of good breeding despite his rough exterior. Mrs. Chen proved to be a small, efficient Chinese woman who spoke little English but communicated volumes through her expressive face and capable hands. The meal she'd prepared was simple but expertly done: roast beef, potatoes, green beans, and fresh bread with butter churned that morning. "Mrs. Chen has been with me for 3 years, Beau explained as they ate. "Her husband worked the railroad construction crews until he was killed in a dynamite accident. She needed work, and I needed someone reliable to manage the house. She's a treasure, but she's getting older and could use help with the heavier tasks." Annabeth nodded, filing away this information about her new responsibilities. "What time does the household usually rise?" "I'm up before dawn to check the cattle and give the hands their assignments for the day. Mrs. Chen usually starts breakfast around 5. The men expect to eat by 6, so they can be in the saddle by full light." 5 in the morning. Annabeth had rarely been awake before 8 in her life, and never by choice. But she simply nodded again. "I'll need to learn your routines and preferences. Perhaps Mrs. Chen could show me around the kitchen tomorrow." She'd like that. She's been worried about managing everything alone much longer. They finished the meal with polite conversation about the ranch operations and the town's other residents. Beau was a careful host, making sure her water glass stayed full and that she had enough to eat. But there was a distance between them, a formal politeness that felt strange after the intensity of their church exchange. When Mrs. Chen began clearing the dishes, Annabeth rose to help, but the older woman waved her away with a flood of rapid Chinese and gestures that clearly indicated the new bride should not be working on her wedding night. "She says it's not appropriate," Beau translated with the ghost of a smile. "You're the mistress of the house now, and she has her pride in her work." Annabeth felt awkward, standing idle, while another woman cleaned up after her meal, but she recognized the delicate politics involved. Tomorrow she would begin establishing her role here, but tonight she was still finding her footing. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" Beau asked. He showed her through the rooms with quiet pride, his study with its roll-top desk and shelves of agricultural journals, the parlor with its comfortable chairs arranged before the fireplace, the large kitchen with its modern wood-burning stove and well-stocked pantry. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but there was something missing, the feminine touches that made a house a home. "It's very fine," Annabeth said honestly. "You've built something solid here." "It's a good foundation," Beau agreed. "But it needs," he paused, seeming to search for words. "A woman's touch?" Annabeth suggested. "A family," he said simply. "A house is just buildings until there's a family in it." They were standing in the parlor, and the evening light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the floor. Annabeth was acutely aware of being alone with this man, who was now her husband, of the intimacy that was expected and the unfamiliarity that made everything feel uncertain. "Beau," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was thinking. He turned to face her fully, his expression patient. "What is it?" "In church today, when you spoke about what you wanted, I meant what I said in response. I want to be the partner you need, but I should be honest with you about what I don't know." "Such as?" She felt heat creep up her neck. "I've never managed a household of this size. I've never cooked for working men or handled ranch accounts. I've never—" She paused, then forced herself to continue. "I've never been married before. I know what's expected, but I don't have experience with the practical realities." Beau studied her face with those perceptive dark eyes. "Are you asking for time to learn, or are you asking for patience?" "Both, I suppose." He nodded slowly. "I'm not expecting you to transform overnight, Annabeth. If I wanted a woman who already knew everything about ranch life, I would have married one of the local girls. I chose you because I saw strength in your letters and intelligence. Those matter more than experience. And the other aspects of marriage?" The words came out in a rush, and she immediately wished she could take them back. But Beau didn't seem scandalized by her directness. If anything, his expression gentled. "That will happen when you're ready for it to happen. We have time to become comfortable with each other first." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by something that might have been disappointment. "Thank you for understanding. We're partners now, Annabeth. Partners communicate about what they need." As she prepared for bed that night in the guest room, Annabeth reflected on the strangeness of her situation. She was married to a man she barely knew, committed to a life she'd never lived, in a place that felt as foreign as another country. Yet somehow, Beau's straightforward honesty made her feel safer than all the pretty manners and social conventions she'd left behind in Philadelphia. Tomorrow, her real education would begin. Tonight, she was simply a bride, trying to fall asleep in a strange bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier night and wondering what kind of woman she would become in this new life she'd chosen. Annabeth woke to darkness and the sound of men's voices outside her window. For a moment, she lay disoriented, unsure where she was or why her bed felt unfamiliar. Then memory returned, the wedding, the new house, the beginning of her life as Mrs. Beau Rawlins. The luminous hands of the small clock on her nightstand showed 4:30. Through her window, she could see lantern light moving between the barn and bunkhouse as the ranch hands began their day. Somewhere in the house, she could hear the quiet sounds of Mrs. Chen starting breakfast preparations. Annabeth rose quickly and dressed in her plainest dark wool dress, pinning her hair back in a simple arrangement that would stay neat while she worked. When she made her way to the kitchen, she found Mrs. Chen standing at the massive wood-burning stove, stirring something in a large pot that smelled of coffee and chicory. "Good morning," Annabeth said softly. Mrs. Chen turned and smiled, gesturing toward the coffee pot with obvious pleasure. She poured a cup of the strong, dark brew and handed it to Annabeth, then pointed to herself and said slowly, "May Chen." "Annabeth," she replied, pointing to herself in return. "Mrs. Rollins now, I suppose." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly and launched into a rapid explanation in Chinese, punctuated by gestures toward the stove, the pantry, and the dining room. Although Annabeth couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. This was how the morning routine worked, and Mrs. Chen was ready to teach her new mistress the intricacies of feeding 8 hungry ranch hands plus Beau. For the next hour, Annabeth watched and tried to help as Mrs. Chen prepared what seemed like enough food for a small army. There were hotcakes by the dozen, slabs of bacon, scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, biscuits with gravy, and preserved fruit. Everything was cooked in large quantities and served in sturdy ceramic dishes that could withstand the rough handling of working men. Beau appeared in the kitchen doorway, just as Mrs. Chen was ladling the last of the hotcakes onto a platter. He looked freshly washed, but ready for outdoor work, wearing sturdy pants, boots, and a wool shirt with the sleeves rolled up. In his hand was a tarnished military medal that he'd apparently retrieved from somewhere private. "You're up early," he said to Annabeth, sounding pleased but not particularly surprised. "I want to learn the routine," she replied. "Mrs. Chen has been very patient with my ignorance." Beau translated this to Mrs. Chen, who beamed and patted Annabeth's arm approvingly. The older woman said something rapid in Chinese, and Beau chuckled. "She says you have good instincts and willing hands." High praise from Mrs. Chen. As they carried the food to the dining room, Annabeth got her first look at the ranch hands who would be part of her daily responsibility. They were a mixed group, some young, some grizzled, all lean and weathered from outdoor work. They removed their hats when she entered the room and mumbled polite greetings, but she could see them assessing her with curious eyes. Jake Morrison, the foreman, was a man in his 40s with intelligent grey eyes and the easy authority of someone accustomed to managing both cattle and men. He introduced the others, Tommy and Pete, brothers barely out of their teens, Carlos, a quiet Mexican man with skilled hands and a gentle way with horses, Old Sam, who'd been working cattle since before the war, and 3 others whose names Annabeth tried to memorize while serving coffee and making sure everyone had enough food. The conversation during breakfast was about ranch business, which pastures needed checking, where to move the cattle for better grass, repairs needed on fencing and equipment. Annabeth listened carefully, trying to understand the rhythm and priorities of this new world she'd entered. After the men left for their work, she helped Mrs. Chen clear the dishes and began her real education in frontier housekeeping. The kitchen was well equipped, but everything operated on a larger scale than she was used to. The stove consumed wood at an alarming rate. The water had to be heated for washing dishes and carried from a pump near the back door. The pantry held sacks of flour and beans measured in hundredweights, not pounds. Mrs. Chen proved to be a patient but exacting teacher. She showed Annabeth how to bank the fire in the stove so it would stay hot without wasting fuel, how to test the oven temperature by holding her hand inside, how to gauge quantities when cooking for large groups. When Annabeth made mistakes, and she made many, Mrs. Chen simply corrected her with gentle gestures and repeated demonstrations. The morning flew by in a blur of new information and unfamiliar tasks. By the time the men came in for the midday meal, Annabeth felt as though she'd been working for days instead of hours. Her back ached from bending over the stove, her hands were red from hot water and lye soap, and she was beginning to understand why frontier women aged quickly. But she was also beginning to feel something she hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. In Philadelphia, her days had been filled with social calls, needlework, and other genteel activities that felt meaningless in retrospect. Here, everything she did mattered directly to the people depending on her. The bread she helped bake would feed men who worked hard all day. The coffee she learned to make properly would warm them on cold mornings. The meals she prepared would give them energy for the demanding physical labor that kept the ranch running. After lunch, while Mrs. Chen rested during the heat of the day, Annabeth explored the house more thoroughly. In Beau's study, she found account books that showed the ranch's financial operations in careful, masculine handwriting. The numbers told a story of steady growth and careful management, but also of significant expenses and the constant challenges of weather, market prices, and the dozen things that could go wrong in the cattle business. She was studying a ledger that tracked feed costs when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Beau appeared in the doorway, his shirt dusty and his hair damp with sweat. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, nodding toward the books. "You keep very detailed records," she said. "These show good profit margins, but also some significant risks. The loan payments on the new grazing land are substantial." He stepped into the room, looking surprised. "You understand bookkeeping?" "I helped manage my father's business accounts for several years before." She paused, then continued. "Before things became difficult, I have some experience with financial management." Beau sank into the chair across from his desk, studying her with new interest. "That wasn't in your letter. You didn't ask about business skills. You asked about household management and willingness to work." "Fair enough." He leaned back in his chair. "What do you think of the ranch's financial position?" Annabeth looked down at the ledger again, choosing her words carefully. "You've built something impressive, but you're also carrying significant debt to do it. The ranch is profitable, but there isn't much margin for error if you hit a bad year." "That's a fair assessment." His voice held a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "Most women wouldn't understand the numbers well enough to see the risks. Most women aren't trained to see them. I was fortunate that my father believed daughters should understand money as well as sons." They talked for another hour about the ranch operations, markets, and the financial strategies Beau was using to build his empire. Annabeth found herself relaxing as they discussed practical matters, feeling more like herself than she had since arriving in Colorado. When evening came and the men returned for supper, she helped serve the meal with growing confidence. The ranch hands seemed more comfortable with her presence, and several complimented the cornbread she'd helped prepare under Mrs. Chen's supervision. After the kitchen was cleaned and Mrs. Chen had retired to her small room off the pantry, Annabeth and Beau sat in the parlor with coffee and the comfortable silence of a day well spent. "You did well today," Beau said finally. "Mrs. Chen is impressed, and she doesn't impress easily. I have a great deal still to learn." "We all do. But you're approaching it the right way, watching, listening, asking questions when you need to." He paused, then added, "I found something today that I thought you should have." He handed her the military medal she'd seen him carrying that morning. It was tarnished with age, hanging from a faded ribbon, and inscribed with words she couldn't quite make out in the lamplight. "It was awarded to me after a battle in Georgia," he said quietly, "for leading my men through a situation that should have killed us all. I've kept it all these years, but I've never been sure why." Annabeth turned the medal over in her hands, feeling the weight of its significance. It represents courage under pressure, the willingness to take responsibility for others, even when the outcome is uncertain. Maybe, or maybe it just represents surviving when others didn't. His voice was quiet, distant. "I've had dreams about that battle for 15 years. Always the same, hearing the boys who didn't make it calling for help I couldn't give them." The raw honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. Without thinking, she reached across the space between their chairs and covered his hand with hers. "You can't save everyone, Beau. Sometimes survival is the best anyone can do." He looked down at their joined hands, and she could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Maybe that's why I needed someone strong beside me, so I wouldn't have to carry everything alone anymore." When she went to bed that night, Annabeth placed the medal carefully in her dresser drawer next to her mother's sheet music. Two talismans from their respective pasts, representing the burdens and losses that had shaped them both. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new lessons, but tonight she felt as though she was beginning to understand the man she'd married and the woman she might become as his partner. 3 weeks into her marriage, Annabeth stood in the kitchen, holding the broken pieces of her mother's last teacup, tears streaming down her face in a way that had nothing to do with the shattered porcelain and everything to do with the woman she was becoming. The delicate china had survived the journey from Philadelphia, had weathered her first clumsy attempts at frontier housekeeping, had been carefully washed and treasured as her one remaining link to the refined life she'd left behind. Now it lay in fragments on the rough-hewn kitchen floor, destroyed by her own work-roughened hands as she'd tried to balance too many dishes while rushing to clean up after the morning meal. She knelt to gather the pieces, her calloused fingers when had they become so calloused, carefully collecting each shard as if she could somehow restore what was broken. The largest piece still showed part of the delicate rose pattern her mother had loved, painted in soft pink and gold that seemed impossibly delicate in this world of iron and leather and harsh necessities. "Mrs. Rollins?" She looked up to find Beau standing in the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hands, and concern written across his weathered features. He must have seen her through the window and come to investigate. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know it's foolish to cry over a cup, but it was my mother's. The last piece I had of her china set." Instead of the impatient dismissal she expected, Beau crossed the kitchen and knelt beside her on the floor. His large hands joined hers in collecting the scattered pieces, handling them with surprising gentleness. "Tell me about her," he said quietly. The simple request broke something loose in Annabeth's chest. "She was beautiful," she began, her voice shaky, "not just in appearance, though she was that too. She had this way of making everything around her more graceful, more refined. She could turn a simple meal into an elegant dinner party, could make anyone feel welcome in our home." Beau continued gathering fragments while she spoke, his movements careful and respectful. "She played piano beautifully. Mozart, Chopin, Beethoven she could make the keys sing. Every evening after dinner, she would play for my father and me. It was—" Annabeth's voice caught. "It was the happiest time of day in our house." "What happened to her?" "Consumption. The doctors tried everything, but she grew weaker and weaker until—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Beau placed the last piece of china in her palm and closed her fingers gently around them. "How old were you?" 18. Old enough to understand that she was dying, young enough to believe that somehow love could prevent it. Annabeth looked down at the broken porcelain. "Father was never the same after. The business began failing within a year, though I didn't understand then that it was because he'd lost heart for everything." They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the morning sounds of ranch life continuing outside the kitchen windows. Finally, Beau spoke. "My mother used to sing while she cooked," he said. "Old Irish songs her grandmother had taught her. I can still hear her voice sometimes when I'm working alone in the fields." Annabeth looked at him with surprise. In 3 weeks of marriage, he'd rarely spoken about his family beyond the basic facts of their deaths. "She would have liked you," he continued. "She always said that a woman's strength wasn't in her softness, but in what she was willing to do for the people she loved. Even though I break the dishes and burn the bread." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Especially because you keep trying, even when you break the dishes and burn the bread." Something warm unfurled in Annabeth's chest at his words. She'd been so focused on her failures, her inexperience, her constant struggle to meet the demands of ranch life, that she hadn't noticed Beau, watching her efforts with approval rather than criticism. "I feel like I'm losing pieces of myself every day," she admitted. "My hands are rough, my skin is brown from the sun, my dresses are stained with things I can't even identify. Sometimes I look in the mirror and wonder what happened to the refined lady who left Philadelphia. Maybe she's becoming something better," Beau said gently, "stronger, more real." He helped her to her feet, his hands steady and warm on her arms. For a moment they stood close together in the morning light, streaming through the kitchen window, and Annabeth felt something shift between them, a deepening of understanding, a recognition that went beyond their practical arrangement. "I should get back to the men," Beau said finally, but he didn't immediately step away. "Of course." Annabeth smoothed her apron, suddenly conscious of how she must look with tear-stained cheeks and disheveled hair. "I need to start preparing the midday meal anyway." But as he turned to go, she caught his sleeve. "Beau, thank you for understanding about the cup, for foreseeing something in me that I'm not sure I see in myself yet." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "Give it time, Annabeth. You're stronger than you know." After he left, she swept up the last of the porcelain fragments and threw them away, but the conversation lingered in her mind as she worked. That afternoon, when Mrs. Chen was resting and the house was quiet, she found herself in the parlor staring at the piano that sat silent in the corner. It was a fine instrument, well maintained, despite its isolation on the frontier. Someone, Beau, presumably kept it tuned, though she'd never heard anyone play it. Her fingers traced the smooth wood of the bench, remembering countless evenings spent at her mother's side, learning to coax music from the keys. Almost without conscious decision, she sat down and opened the keyboard cover. Her hands found the familiar position, muscle memory guiding her to the opening notes of her mother's favorite Chopin nocturne. The sound filled the empty room, sweet and melancholy and achingly familiar. She played through the piece once, then again, losing herself in the complex harmonies and delicate phrasing that had been her mother's specialty. For those few minutes, she was transported back to the elegant parlor of her childhood, with its silk wallpaper and crystal chandelier and the scent of her mother's rose perfume. When the last notes faded, she found Beau standing in the parlor doorway, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said quickly, moving to close the keyboard. "I know you were working, and I—" "Don't stop," his voice was quiet but firm. "Please. It's been a long time since there was music in this house." She turned back to the piano, her heart beating faster. "What would you like to hear?" "Whatever you want to play." So she played Mozart's gentle sonatas, Bach's precise inventions, Beethoven's passionate crescendos. Her fingers remembered pieces she thought she'd forgotten, melodies that had been part of her daily life for so many years. The music filled the room and spilled out into the rest of the house, bringing warmth and beauty to spaces that had known only practicality for too long. When she finally stopped, her hands tired from the unaccustomed exercise, she found that Beau had settled into one of the armchairs to listen. His face held an expression of such profound contentment that it took her breath away. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Your mother taught you well. She always said that music was the one thing no one could ever take away from you. Even when everything else was lost, the songs would remain." Annabeth's fingers lingered on the keys. "I'd forgotten that somehow. I've been so focused on becoming what I thought you needed that I lost sight of what I might bring to this marriage from my old life." "You don't have to choose between who you were and who you're becoming," Beau said. "The best partnerships take the strengths each person brings and build something new together." That evening, after the ranch hands had been fed and the kitchen cleaned, Annabeth played again while Beau worked on the ranch accounts at his desk. The music seemed to ease something in both of them, creating a bridge between their different worlds and experiences. Later, as they sat together in comfortable silence, Beau surprised her by moving from his chair to sit beside her on the piano bench. "Show me," he said, placing his large, work-roughened hands on the keys beside hers. "Show you what?" "How to make music. I can't play, but I'd like to understand what you do with your hands that creates such beauty." She guided his fingers to a simple melody, showing him how to press the keys with just enough force to create clear tones. His hands were too large and clumsy for any real musical expression, but his concentration and genuine interest touched her more than any perfectly executed performance could have. "It's harder than it looks," he said ruefully after struggling through a basic scale. "Everything worthwhile is harder than it looks," she replied, then realized the truth of her own words. "Ranch work, marriage, building a life with someone you barely know, it's all harder than it appears from the outside. But worth the effort?" She looked at his profile in the lamplight, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the small scar that marked some long-ago injury, the careful way he was still trying to coax music from the keys. "Yes," she said softly, "worth the effort." When they finally said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, Annabeth felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them. She was still sleeping in the guest room, still learning to navigate the complex dynamics of frontier marriage, but the walls between them felt less insurmountable than they had that morning. As she prepared for bed, she realized she hadn't thought about the broken teacup in hours. The loss still hurt, but it no longer felt like the destruction of everything she'd been. Instead, it felt like the necessary breaking that sometimes precedes new, growth-painful but ultimately purposeful. Outside her window, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch, cattle settling in the pastures, horses moving restlessly in the corral, the distant cry of a coyote on the ridge. These sounds were becoming familiar now, part of the rhythm of her new life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the partnership Beau had offered. But tonight, she fell asleep with music still echoing in her mind, and the memory of her husband's hands trying to follow hers across the piano keyser. Small gesture that spoke of larger possibilities for the life they were building together. The branding season brought neighbors from ranches scattered across 3 counties, their wives and children in tow for what served as both necessary work and social gathering. Annabeth had been dreading the event for weeks, knowing it would be her first real test as mistress of the Rollins ranch in front of the broader community. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the wagons arrive, her stomach tight with nerves. The women climbing down from the seats looked capable and weathered, dressed in practical clothes that showed the wear of hard use. They moved with the easy confidence of people who belonged in this landscape, who had earned their place through years of frontier living. "They're going to judge me," she murmured to Mrs. Chen, who was kneading bread dough at the kitchen table with methodical precision. Mrs. Chen looked up and said something rapid in Chinese, then switched to her careful English. "Good women, they help. You see." But when Annabeth stepped onto the front porch to greet the arriving guests, the looks she received were anything but welcoming. She heard the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, saw the assessing glances that took in her still soft appearance, and found it wanting. "So you're the Eastern bride," said Martha Kellerman, wife of the neighboring rancher whose spread bordered the Rawlins land to the north. She was a formidable woman in her 50s, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, who clearly served as some kind of unofficial leader among the ranch wives. "We were all curious to meet the woman who finally caught Beau Rawlins." "I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Kellerman," Annabeth replied, offering her hand. "I hope I can be of help with the work today." Several of the women exchanged glances that Annabeth couldn't quite interpret. Ruth Morrison, the foreman's wife, stepped forward with a kinder smile. "We always appreciate extra hands during branding," she said diplomatically. "It's a busy time for everyone." The morning began with the organized chaos of separating cattle and preparing the branding fires. Annabeth tried to make herself useful, but quickly realized that the other women had established routines developed over years of working together. They moved through their tasks with practiced efficiency, while she struggled to understand even the basics of what needed to be done. "Careful with that iron, honey," Martha called out when Annabeth picked up one of the branding tools. "Those aren't parlor decorations." The condescending tone stung, but Annabeth forced herself to smile and ask for instruction. She spent the morning learning to heat the irons properly, to recognize when they were ready for use, to hand them to the men at exactly the right moment. Her hands were soon blistered from the heat, her dress stained with smoke and dirt, but she persevered. It was during the midday meal that the real trial began. The women had set up long tables in the shade of the house, loaded with food that each family had contributed. Annabeth had worked since dawn, preparing her share roast beef, cornbread, green beans with bacon, and apple pie made with fruit from the ranch's small orchard. She'd been proud of her efforts, thinking she was finally beginning to master frontier cooking. But as the women began serving and tasting each other's contributions, she quickly realized her mistake. "This cornbread is awfully fine, textured," observed Susan Wheeler, the wife of a smaller rancher from the South Valley. "Almost like cake bread. Is this how they make it back east?" "The beef is tender," added another woman, "but it doesn't have much flavor. Seems like it could use more seasoning." Each comment was delivered with a sweet smile, but Annabeth heard the criticism underneath. Her food was too refined, too mild, too different from what these frontier families expected and enjoyed. "I'm still learning," she said quietly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Oh, we all had to learn sometime," Martha said with false kindness. Of course, most of us started cooking when we were girls, helping our mothers feed ranch hands and family. I suppose it's different when you've had servants to do the heavy work. The comment hung in the air like smoke from the branding fires. Annabeth felt every eye at the table turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to the challenge. "You're right," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I did have an easier life back east. I had servants and fine clothes and never had to worry about whether there would be enough food on the table. But that life is gone now, and I'm trying to build something new here." "Are you?" Martha's tone was skeptical. "Or are you just playing at ranch life until you get tired of the work and head back where things are comfortable?" Before Annabeth could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the cattle pens. Men's voices shouted urgent warnings, and she could see Beau and several others running toward the corrals where the day's branding was taking place. "Bulls loose," someone yelled. "Get back! Everyone get back!" The women rose from the table as one, years of frontier experience, telling them that a loose bull was no minor inconvenience. Martha and the others began herding the children toward the safety of the house, their movements quick and efficient. But Annabeth found herself moving in the opposite direction. Drawn by some instinct she didn't fully understand toward the source of the danger. Through the dust and confusion, she could see that one of the massive breeding bulls had broken free from the holding pen and was charging toward a group of men who were scrambling to get out of its path. One figure wasn't moving fast enough. Young Tommy Morrison, barely 18 and still learning the cattle business, had stumbled and fallen directly in the animal's path. The bull, maddened by the noise and smoke and unfamiliar activity, was bearing down on him with deadly intent. Without thinking, Annabeth grabbed a branding iron from the fire and ran toward the corral. She could hear women screaming behind her, could see Beau racing to intercept the bull from the other side, but she was closer and there wasn't time to think about consequences. She reached Tommy just as the bull lowered its head to charge. The animal was enormous, easily 2,000 pounds of muscle and fury, but Annabeth had grown up around her father's carriage horses and understood that even the largest animals responded to confidence and decisive action. She stepped between Tommy and the bull, raising the hot iron like a weapon and shouting at the top of her lungs, Get back, you miserable beast!" The bull skidded to a halt, surprised by this small human who showed no fear. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, woman and animal, locked in a contest of wills that could go either way. Then Beau was there, rope in hand, along with Jake Morrison and 2 other experienced cattlemen. Working together, they managed to get a line around the bull's neck and lead it back to the holding pen, but not before the animal had demonstrated just how dangerous the situation had been. "Tommy, you all right, son?" Jake called out, helping his younger brother to his feet. "Yes, sir," Tommy replied shakily. "Thanks to Mrs. Rollins. She saved my life." Annabeth stood frozen in place, the branding iron still clutched in her hands, as the full realization of what she'd done washed over her. She had faced down a charging bull, something that could have killed her as easily as stepping on an Annth, somehow managed to come out unharmed. "Annabeth." Beau's voice was rough with emotion as he approached her. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen anyone do." "Probably both," she managed, her voice shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. He gently took the branding iron from her hands and pulled her against his chest, holding her tightly while she trembled with delayed reaction. She could feel his heart racing, could hear the sharp edge of fear in his breathing that told her how close they'd both come to losing something precious. When they finally broke apart, Annabeth found herself facing a circle of ranch wives whose expressions had undergone a complete transformation. Where before there had been skepticism and cool judgment, now there was unmistakable respect. "Well," Martha Kellerman said finally, "I guess that settles the question of whether you've got backbone enough for ranch life." The rest of the day passed in a blur of congratulations and newfound acceptance. The women who had been coolly polite that morning now included her in their conversations, asked for her opinions, and shared their own stories of the dangers and challenges they'd faced on the frontier. That evening, after the last of the neighbors had departed and the ranch had settled back into its normal rhythm, Annabeth and Beau sat together on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. "You surprised everyone today," Beau said quietly, "including me." "I surprised myself." She touched her throat, which was still sore from shouting at the bull. "I don't know where that came from. I just saw Tommy in danger and you acted, without thinking about your own safety, without calculating the risks. That's not something you can teach someone, Annabeth. That's just who you are." She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him and the quiet strength that had drawn her to accept his proposal in the first place. "The other women, they accepted me after that." As if facing down the bull proved something to them. "It did. It proved you're one of them now, that you belong here." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Annabeth realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her during the day's events. The refined Eastern lady who had stepped off the train 6 weeks ago wouldn't have grabbed a hot iron and faced down a charging bull. That woman would have screamed and fainted and left the heroics to others. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more capable than she'd ever imagined she could become. Someone who belonged on this frontier ranch, who could stand as an equal partner beside the formidable man who had become her husband. When they finally went inside for the night, Beau paused at the foot of the stairs that led to their separate bedrooms. For a moment, the air between them hummed with possibility, with the recognition that their relationship had crossed some invisible threshold during the day's dramatic events. "Annabeth," he said softly, reaching out to touch her face with gentle fingers, "you were magnificent today." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her, not the careful, ceremonial kiss of their wedding day, but something deeper and more passionate that spoke of genuine desire and growing love. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair as she pressed against the solid warmth of his body. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the question hanging between them was clear, even though neither spoke it aloud. Annabeth began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was feeling. "I know," Beau said gently. "When you're ready, there's no rush." But as she prepared for bed that night in the guest room that was beginning to feel more like a prison than a sanctuary, Annabeth found herself wondering how much longer she would need to be ready. The woman who had faced down a bull and earned the respect of her neighbors was surely brave enough to take the final step toward becoming a true wife to the man who was already becoming so much more than she had bargained for. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by young Billy Patterson, who rode for the telegraph office in town. Annabeth was in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds from between the rows of late vegetables, when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching the ranch. She straightened, shading her eyes against the October sun, and watched Billy rein in his lathered horse at the front porch. Telegrams were rare occurrences at the ranch, usually bringing news of cattle prices or business matters. This one, however, was addressed to her. "Mrs. Rollins," Billy called out, waving the yellow paper. "Got a wire for you from back east, marked urgent." Annabeth's stomach clenched with immediate dread. Urgent telegrams were seldom bearers of good news, and her first thought was that something had happened to her father or one of her brothers. She wiped her dirt-stained hands on her apron and hurried to meet Billy. "Thank you," she said, taking the telegram with fingers that trembled slightly. Billy tipped his hat and rode off, leaving her standing alone on the porch with the unopened message in her hands. For a moment, she hesitated. Something about the weight of the paper, the formal way her name was written on the outside, felt ominous. But avoiding bad news had never made it disappear, so she unfolded the telegram and read the words that would change everything. "Annabeth, stop business recovered. Stop father's investments paid off. Handsomely stop. Debts cleared with substantial profit. Stop marriage. Unnecessary. Stop return home. Immediately. Stop comfortable life awaits. Stop your loving. Brother Charles." She read the message 3 times before the full meaning penetrated. Her family's financial ruin, the disaster that had forced her into this arranged marriage, had been miraculously reversed. The business ventures her father had thought were failures had apparently paid off after all. The debts that had seemed insurmountable were gone. Her sacrifice had been unnecessary. The telegram fluttered from her nerveless fingers to land on the porch boards. She sank into one of the wooden chairs Beau had built, staring out at the landscape that had become familiar over the past 2 months. The red rock cliffs glowed in the morning light, and she could see cattle scattered across the pastures like dark dots against the golden grass. In the distance, smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney where Mrs. Chen was preparing the midday meal. All of it, the ranch, the hard work, the gradual transformation from Eastern lady to frontier wife, had been based on a lie. Or if not a lie, then a desperate gamble her family had made without telling her the full truth. They had sent her west to secure her future through marriage, while they waited to see if their failing investments might recover. Now that they had, she was being summoned home like a child called in from playing. The sound of approaching boots on the porch made her look up. Beau was returning from the morning's work, his shirt dusty and his face relaxed with the satisfaction of a productive day. When he saw her expression, his steps slowed. "What is it?" he asked, his voice immediately alert to trouble. Wordlessly, she handed him the telegram. She watched his face as he read, saw his expression change from concern to confusion to something that looked like betrayal. "Your family lied to you," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Or they lied to me about how bad things really were. I don't know which is worse." Beau folded the telegram with precise, deliberate movements. "So you'll be leaving?" The flat certainty in his voice stung. "Is that what you think? That I'll pack my bags and run back to Philadelphia the moment my comfortable life becomes available again? Won't you?" He looked at her directly, his dark eyes unreadable. "You married me out of desperation, Annabeth. Now that the desperation is gone, what reason do you have to stay?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She rose from the chair, pacing to the porch railing as she struggled to sort through the tangle of emotions his words had unleashed. "You think this has all been pretense?" she demanded. "The work, the learning, the connection we've been building between us. You think it was all just me making the best of a bad situation? I think you're a woman of honor who's been trying to fulfill an obligation, but obligations can be dissolved, Annabeth. Marriages based on necessity can be annulled when the necessity disappears." She whirled to face him, anger flaring hot in her chest. "Is that what you want? For me to leave? Would it be easier for you to go back to your splendid isolation, your perfectly ordered ranch, where no one disturbs your routine or challenges your assumptions?" "This isn't about what I want," Beau said, but something in his voice suggested otherwise. "This is about you having choices you didn't have before. Your family has money again. You could marry anyone you please, live anywhere you want. You don't have to settle for a rough cowboy in the middle of nowhere." "Settle?" The word came out as a harsh laugh. "You think I've been settling? Haven't you?" He stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. 2 months ago, you were a refined lady who'd never done a day's hard work in her life. Now you're milking cows and cooking for ranch hands and facing down charging bulls and learning to shoot straight and keeping your account books balanced to the penny," she interrupted fiercely. "And playing piano in the evenings while you pretend to read but really just listen to the music. And lying awake at night wondering when you're going to stop treating me like a guest and start treating me like a wife." The last words hung between them in the sudden silence. Beau's expression shifted, surprise replacing the carefully maintained distance. "You want to be my wife?" he asked, his voice rough. "Really? Not just because you have to be, but because you choose to be?" "I thought I'd made that clear." Annabeth felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "But apparently I was wrong. Apparently you've been waiting all this time for me to leave." "No." The word was sharp, definitive. "God, no. I've been trying not to hope you'd stay because I was afraid." He broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that you'd figure out you deserved better than this, better than me." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for you to leave since the day you arrived, Annabeth. Every morning I wake up expecting to find a note saying you've gone back where you belong." The raw honesty in his voice broke something open in her chest. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. "Where I belong," she repeated softly. "Beau, don't you understand? This is where I belong. Not because I have to be here, but because I choose to be. Because somewhere in the past 2 months, this place became home, and you became—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "I became what?" he prompted, his eyes intense on her face. "You became the man I love," she said simply. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Beau closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face as he searched her expression. "You love me?" he asked, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. "Yes, you impossible man. I love your stubbornness and your integrity, and the way you built this place with your own 2 hands. I love that you see strength in me I didn't know I possessed. I love that you expect me to be your equal partner instead of some decorative ornament." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "And I love that you're brave enough to ask for what you really want, instead of settling for what's convenient." "Annabeth, I'm not leaving, Beau, not because I have to stay, but because I want to stay. Because this is my home now, and you're my husband, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let my family's financial recovery destroy what we've built together." He kissed her then, hard and desperate and full of relief, his arms coming around her to pull her against his chest. She kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all her love and commitment and determination into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Beau rested his forehead against hers. "I've been a fool," he said quietly. "I should have told you weeks ago how I felt about you. Should have trusted that what was growing between us was real." "We've both been fools," Annabeth replied, too afraid to admit we'd found something worth fighting for. They stood together on the porch, holding each other as the sun climbed higher and the ranch continued its daily rhythm around them. The telegram lay forgotten on the boards at their feet, its offer of an easier life rejected in favor of the harder but more rewarding path they had chosen together. "I'll need to write to my family," Annabeth said finally, "to tell them I'm staying. Will they understand?" She smiled, thinking of Charles and her father and the comfortable world they were offering her. "Eventually, they'll have to." "No regrets?" Beau asked, his hands gentle on her face. "No looking back at what you're giving up?" "The only thing I'd regret," she said firmly, "is letting fear or duty or other people's expectations keep me from the life I want. And the life I want is here, with you." That evening, as she sat at Beau's desk, composing her reply to her family's telegram, Annabeth reflected on how much had changed since that first desperate letter that had brought her west. She had come to Colorado as a woman with no choices, accepting an arranged marriage as her only option for survival. Now she was choosing to stay as a woman who understood her own strength, who had found love in the most unexpected place, and who was ready to build a future based on partnership rather than necessity. The telegram from her family had offered her freedom, but she had discovered that true freedom wasn't the absence of obligation. It was the power to choose your own obligations wisely. She signed her reply with a steady hand. "Staying, stop found home, stop found love, stop very happy, stop your sister Annabeth Rollins." The surname felt right in a way it never had before, not because she had to bear it, but because she had chosen to claim it as her own. 3 days after the telegram's arrival, Annabeth stood at her bedroom window, the guest room that still served as her sanctuary, watching the morning mist rise from the pastures and wrestling with a decision that felt larger than anything she'd faced since stepping off the train in Copper Creek. The one-way ticket to Philadelphia lay on her dresser, purchased weeks ago when she'd first begun to doubt whether she truly belonged on the frontier. She had kept it hidden, a secret escape route that she'd never intended to use, but couldn't bring herself to destroy. Now it seemed to mock her, a reminder of how close she'd come to running away from the most important choice of her life. Outside, she could hear Beau giving instructions to the ranch hands for the day's work. His voice carried the easy authority of a man who knew his business, but underneath it, she detected something newer, contentment that hadn't been there before their conversation on the porch. He was whistling as he walked toward the barn, an unconscious expression of happiness that made her chest tighten with emotion. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Chen with questions about the day's meals. Instead, Beau stepped into the room, his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face that she couldn't quite read. His gaze took in the packed traveling bag on her bed, the train ticket on her dresser, and her still neat appearance that suggested she hadn't yet committed to the day's ranch work. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "No." The answer came without hesitation, surprising them both with its firmness. "I was just saying goodbye to who I used to be, I suppose." She picked up the train ticket and held it out to him. "Would you mind burning this? I don't want the temptation anymore." Beau took the ticket, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She moved to the dresser and began unpacking the traveling bag, placing her belongings back in the drawers with deliberate finality. "I've been hiding in this room for 3 months, Beau, treating our marriage like a temporary arrangement, keeping one foot out the door in case things didn't work out. But that's not fair to either of us." He watched her methodical movements, understanding dawning in his dark eyes. "You're ready to move into the master bedroom." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "If you'll have me." Instead of responding with words, Beau crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt about his feelings. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've been waiting for you to be ready," he said softly, "not just for the physical aspect of marriage, but for the emotional commitment, for choosing us instead of just accepting us." "I choose us," she whispered. "I choose you. I choose this life we're building together." They spent the morning moving her belongings into the master bedroom, a large, comfortable space with windows that looked out over the valley and furniture that Beau had built with his own hands. Mrs. Chen supervised the process with obvious approval, chattering in rapid Chinese that needed no translation. The transition felt both momentous and surprisingly natural. Annabeth's dresses hung beside Beau's shirts in the wardrobe they would now share. Her brush and mirror joined his shaving supplies on the dresser. The sheet music from her mother's piano merged with his collection of agricultural journals on the bedside table. But it was the small details that made the change feel real, the way Beau carefully made space for her things without being asked, the reverent way he handled her mother's lace shawl, the smile that never quite left his face as they worked together to blend their separate lives into something shared. That afternoon brought visitors Jake Morrison and his wife Ruth, who had come to discuss plans for the winter cattle management. As they sat around the kitchen table reviewing maps and feed calculations, Annabeth found herself naturally included in the decision-making process. Beau asked for her opinions on budget allocations, deferred to her judgment on household supplies needed for the winter months, and introduced her ideas about improving efficiency in the daily operations. "You two make a good team," Ruth observed as they prepared to leave. "It's nice to see Beau finally has a true partner instead of just hired help." The comment warmed Annabeth more than any elaborate compliment could have. After months of feeling like an outsider trying to prove herself worthy, she was finally being recognized as an integral part of the ranch's success. That evening, as they shared their first dinner as husband and wife, in the true sense seated across from each other at the small table in their bedroom, away from the bustle of the main house, Annabeth felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. "Tell me about your plans for the ranch," she said, cutting into the tender beef that Mrs. Chen had prepared. "Not just the immediate concerns, but your long-term vision. What do you see when you look 10 years into the future?" Beau's eyes lit up with the passion he always showed when discussing the land and cattle. "Expansion, primarily. There's good grazing land to the south that comes up for sale periodically. If we could acquire another 5,000 acres, we could double our herd size. That would require significant capital investment," Annabeth noted, her mind already working through the financial implications. "New buildings, more equipment, Additional hands. Exactly. It's a risk, but the cattle market is strong and getting stronger. The railroad expansion means we can get our beef to market faster and more efficiently than ever before. They talked late into the evening, sharing dreams and concerns, planning and strategizing like the partners they had become. Annabeth contributed her knowledge of financial management and market analysis, while Beau provided the practical expertise of someone who understood every aspect of cattle ranching. "There's something else," Beau said as they prepared for bed, his voice taking on a different quality. "Something I've been hoping for but didn't want to presume." Annabeth paused in brushing her hair, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "What?" "Children." The simple word carried the weight of all his hopes and fears. "I know it's what I said I wanted in church that day, but I realize now it was presumptuous. The decision should be yours as much as mine." She set down her brush and turned to face him fully. "Do you know what I see when I look 10 years into the future?" He shook his head, waiting. "I see a house full of laughter and music, children who inherit your strength and stubbornness, who grow up understanding that love means working side by side for something bigger than yourself. I see sons who learn to rope cattle and daughters who learn to keep books, because in this family, everyone contributes according to their abilities and interests, not their gender." The relief and joy on his face was unmistakable. "You want children with me? I want everything with you, Beau. The hard work and the celebrations, the failures and the successes, the quiet moments and the dramatic ones. I want to build something lasting that we can be proud of when we're old and grey." When he kissed her this time, it was with the tenderness of new love combined with the passion of deep commitment. As she melted into his embrace, Annabeth marveled at how far they had both traveled from that awkward wedding day when they were strangers bound by necessity. Now they were partners bound by choice, lovers united by genuine affection, and dreamers sharing a vision of the future that seemed suddenly bright with possibility. The next morning brought unexpected challenges that would test their newfound unity. A rider arrived before dawn with news that a winter storm was moving in from the north, unseasonably early and potentially devastating to cattle that hadn't yet been moved to winter pastures. "How much time do we have?" Beau asked, already reaching for his heavy coat. "Maybe 18 hours, the messenger replied. "It's moving fast and looks to be a bad one." Annabeth watched from the bedroom window as Beau rallied the ranch hands, his voice carrying clearly across the yard as he issued rapid instructions. The men scattered to their tasks with practiced efficiency, but she could see the tension in their movements. This was the kind of emergency that could wipe out a season's profits if not handled properly. Without hesitation, she dressed quickly in her warmest clothes and hurried to the kitchen, where Mrs. Chen was already preparing food that could be carried to the men working in the field. "I can help," Annabeth told her, rolling up her sleeves. Together, they packed supplies and prepared hot coffee in large jugs that would stay warm for hours. When Beau returned to the house for additional equipment, he found Annabeth loading a wagon with food and medical supplies. "You don't need to," he began. "Yes, I do," she interrupted firmly. "We're partners, remember? That means I help when things get difficult, not just when it's convenient." He looked at her for a long moment, taking in her determined expression and practical preparations. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that lit up his entire face and made her feel like she could conquer the world. "Let's go save some cattle," he said. They worked through the day in the teeth of the approaching storm, driving hundreds of head of cattle to higher ground, where they would have shelter from the worst of the weather. Annabeth rode beside the men, her horse responding to her increasingly confident commands as she helped guide stubborn steers and anxious mothers with their calves. By evening, her hands were numb with cold and her face was raw from the wind, but every animal was safe. As they returned to the ranch house through the first flurries of snow, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with comfort or ease, and everything to do with meaningful work accomplished alongside people she cared about. "You saved us thousands of dollars today," Beau told her as they stood together in the barn, brushing down their horses by lamplight. "Your quick thinking about the medical supplies meant we could treat the injured animals immediately instead of losing them. We saved thousands of dollars, she corrected. This is a partnership, remember? That night, as the storm raged outside their bedroom windows and they lay warm and safe in each other's arms for the first time as true husband and wife, Annabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come west as a desperate woman with no choices, accepting marriage to a stranger as her only option for survival. But somewhere along the way, desperation had transformed into determination, necessity had evolved into love, and survival had become the foundation for building something beautiful and lasting. "No regrets?" Beau asked softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Only one," she replied, snuggling closer to his warmth. "That it took us so long to get here." She lifted her head to look at him in the dim light. "I love you, Beau Rawlins. Not because I have to, not because it's convenient, but because you're the finest man I've ever known, and I can't imagine my life without you." "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "more than I thought it was possible to love another person." As the storm continued to rage outside, they held each other close and planned their future, a future that would include children and expanded herds, new challenges and shared triumphs. The daily work of building something meaningful together on the frontier they now both called home. The train ticket was nothing but ashes in the fireplace, but Annabeth felt no loss. She had found something far more valuable than an escape route. She had found her true calling as a frontier woman, a ranch wife, and a partner to the man who had challenged her to become more than she ever imagined possible. The morning after the storm brought crystalline air and a landscape transformed by snow, but also news that would shake the foundation of everything Beau and Annabeth had built together. Jake Morrison rode up to the house before breakfast, his face grim with the kind of expression that meant serious trouble. "Bank examiners in town," he announced without preamble as Beau stepped onto the porch. "Word is he's calling in loans across the territory. Some kind of financial panic back east has the bank spooked." Annabeth, who had been feeding chickens in the yard, felt her blood turn to ice. She moved closer to hear the conversation, her mind already racing through the implications. "How bad?" Beau asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Bad enough that Morton Kellerman lost his spread yesterday. 20 years of work, gone because he couldn't cover his loan payment when they moved up the due date." Jake's weathered face was etched with concern. "They're saying anyone carrying significant debt needs to be prepared to pay up immediately or face foreclosure." Beau's jaw tightened. Annabeth knew he was thinking about the substantial loans he'd taken to expand the ranch. The careful calculations that had seemed so reasonable when spread over several years, but would be impossible to meet if called in early. "How much time do we have?" she asked, stepping up beside her husband. Jake looked surprised by her direct question, but answered readily. "Examiners scheduled to review the Rollins account tomorrow morning. If he decides to call in the loans—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the cold air. After Jake left, Beau and Annabeth sat at the kitchen table with the ranch's financial records spread between them. The numbers told a stark story. The ranch was profitable and growing, but most of their capital was tied up in land, cattle, and equipment. If forced to pay the loans immediately, they would have to sell everything at distressed prices, likely losing the ranch entirely. "There might be one option," Annabeth said slowly, staring at a letter that had arrived the previous week. "My family's offer still stands. Charles wrote that they'd be happy to provide financial assistance if I needed it." Beau's expression hardened. "No. Beau, be reasonable. Pride won't save the ranch." "It's not about pride." His voice was sharp with something that looked like pain. "Don't you see? If I take your family's money, then everything they suspected about me becomes true. I become the rough frontier fortune hunter who married their daughter for her connections. That's not what happened. And you know it." "Do I?" He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "Maybe this is exactly what I deserve. Maybe I was fooling myself thinking I could build something permanent out here." Annabeth watched him struggle with demons she was only beginning to understand. In his rigid shoulders and clenched fists, she saw the orphaned boy who had lost everything once before. the soldier who had watched his comrades die, the man who had spent years building walls around his heart to protect himself from exactly this kind of loss. Beau. She rose and went to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Look at me." He turned reluctantly, his dark eyes filled with a despair that broke her heart. "You are not that scared boy anymore," she said firmly. "You are not the soldier who couldn't save his friends. You are my husband, my partner, and the strongest man I know. We will find a way through this together. And if we can't, if we lose everything, then we'll build again, somewhere else, some other way, but we'll do it together." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "The ranch is just land and buildings, Beau. What matters is what we've created between us. That's something no bank can foreclose on." For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and she saw the vulnerability he worked so hard to hide. Then he pulled her against his chest, holding her with desperate intensity. "I can't lose you," he whispered into her hair. "I can't go back to being alone." "You won't have to," she promised. "Whatever happens, we face it together." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the bank examiner's visit, gathering documents and organizing their financial records with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from knowing everything depends on making a good impression. Mrs. Reblouse. Chen worked quietly around them, preparing meals and maintaining the household routine with the understanding that normal life must continue even in the face of potential disaster. That evening, as they sat together in their bedroom reviewing their options one final time, Annabeth made a decision that she knew would either save their marriage or destroy it. She retrieved a small wooden box from her dresser-drawer box that contained her most precious possessions from her old life. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a diamond necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, along with matching earrings and a bracelet. The set was worth more than most people earned in several years, a legacy from a time when the Lane family had been among Philadelphia's social elite. "What's this?" Beau asked as she placed the open box on the bed between them. "My grandmother's jewelry. It's been in the family for 3 generations. She picked up the necklace, letting the diamonds catch the lamplight. "It should be worth enough to cover the loan payments, at least until we can arrange more favorable terms." Beau stared at the jewelry as if it were a snake. "Absolutely not. It's just sitting in a box, Beau. It serves no purpose except as a reminder of a life I no longer want. At least this way, it can help us save the life we're building together. I won't take your family heirlooms to pay my debts." "Our debts," she corrected firmly. "We're partners, remember. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. That includes the problems and the solutions." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched in his lap as he stared at the sparkling jewels. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "If we sell those, there's no going back. You'll have given up the last tangible connection to your old life." "Good," she said simply. "I don't want to go back. I want to go forward, with you, in the life we're creating together. This jewelry represents the past, Beau. I'd rather use it to secure our future." The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather that seemed to mock the gravity of their situation. The bank examiner, Mr. Hartwell, arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, a thin, precise man in an expensive suit who looked around the ranch with the calculating gaze of someone assessing assets for liquidation. Beau met him at the front door with calm dignity, offering coffee and inviting him into the study where all their financial records waited in neat stacks. Annabeth joined them, taking her place beside her husband's chair with the quiet confidence of a woman who belonged exactly where she stood. "Mr. Rollins," Hartwell began, consulting his leather portfolio, "I'm sure you understand why I'm here. The current financial climate requires us to reassess all outstanding loans, particularly those involving significant sums." "I understand," Beau replied evenly. "You'll find our records in order and our payments current." Hartwell spent the next hour reviewing documents, asking pointed questions about cattle prices, land values, and projected income. His expression gave nothing away, but Annabeth could see him making mental calculations that didn't seem to favor their position. Finally, he set down his pen and looked directly at Beau. "Mr. Rawlins, your ranch shows good potential, but your debt-to-asset ratio is concerning given current market uncertainties. I'm prepared to offer you two options." Annabeth felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the verdict that would determine their fate. Option 1. Immediate payment of 75% of your outstanding loans, with the remainder restructured at a higher interest rate. Option 2. Voluntary liquidation of assets to satisfy the debt in full, which would allow you to retain your personal property and avoid the stigma of foreclosure. The words hit like physical blows. Either option would destroy everything they had worked for, everything they had built together. Beau was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the desk, despite what Annabeth knew must be turmoil inside him. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your position, but I believe there may be a third option you haven't considered." Annabeth watched her husband's face as he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. With deliberate care, he opened it and poured the contents onto the desk: her grandmother's diamond necklace, earrings, and bracelet, the gems catching the morning light streaming through the study windows. Mr. Hartwell's eyebrows rose in surprise. He leaned forward to examine the jewelry more closely, his experienced eye immediately recognizing their quality and value. "These pieces," Beau said calmly, "represent sufficient collateral to secure our existing loans and provide the bank with additional security against market fluctuations. I propose we use them to renegotiate our terms rather than liquidate assets that will only increase in value over time." "May I?" Hartwell asked, reaching for the necklace. Beau nodded, and the bank examiner studied the jewelry with the careful attention of someone who understood precious stones. After several minutes, he set the pieces down and consulted his portfolio again. "These are quite valuable," he admitted. "Certainly enough to cover your outstanding obligations. But Mr. Rollins, I must ask, where did you acquire jewelry of this caliber? It seems rather—" "They belong to my wife," Beau said firmly, his hand finding Annabeth's and squeezing gently. "Family heirlooms that she's generously offered to secure our future here." Hartwell's gaze shifted to Annabeth, taking in her simple dress and work-roughened hands with new interest. "Mrs. Rollins, these pieces must have considerable sentimental value. Are you certain you wish to use them in this manner?" The question hung in the air, weighted with implications that went far beyond financial transactions. Annabeth knew that her answer would not only determine the immediate fate of the ranch, but would also define who she had chosen to become in this new life. She looked at the jewel-writhe, tangible reminder of generations of Lane family wealth and privilege, then at her husband's anxious face, and finally at the study around them, with its leather-bound agricultural journals and carefully maintained account books. Everything in this room spoke of dreams built through hard work and determination, of a future crafted by two people who had chosen to build something together. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice clear and steady, "these jewels have been sitting in a box for months, serving no purpose except to remind me of a life I no longer live. Here, they can do something meaningful. They can secure the future of something real and lasting that my husband and I are building together." She picked up the necklace, feeling its familiar weight one last time. "My grandmother was a remarkable woman who believed in making practical choices for the benefit of her family. I think she would approve of this decision." Hartwell nodded slowly, making notes in his portfolio. "Very well. Based on my assessment of these pieces, I believe we can restructure your loans with more favorable terms. The jewelry will serve as additional collateral, which should satisfy the bank's concerns about market volatility." Relief flooded through Annabeth so powerfully that she felt momentarily dizzy. Beside her, she could feel some of the terrible tension leave Beau's shoulders. "However," Hartwell continued, "I will need to take the jewelry with me for formal appraisal and safekeeping. You understand that once they're deposited as collateral, they cannot be retrieved until the loans are satisfied in full." "We understand," Beau said firmly. As Hartwell carefully wrapped the jewelry and placed it in his case, Annabeth felt a profound sense of closure. The last physical ties to her old life were disappearing into a banker's portfolio, but instead of loss, she felt liberation. She was no longer Annabeth Lane of Philadelphia, clinging to remnants of a life that no longer fit. She was Annabeth Rollins of Colorado, a woman who had chosen her future over her past. After Hartwell departed with promises to send the new loan documents within the week, Beau and Annabeth stood together on the front porch, watching his carriage disappear down the road that led back to town. "Are you all right?" Beau asked quietly, his arm around her waist. "I'm more than all right," she replied, leaning into his warmth. "I'm exactly where I belong." He turned to face her, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "You saved us, Annabeth. You saved everything we've worked for." "We saved us," she corrected. "That's what partners do, they find solutions together." "I love you," he said, the words carrying the weight of everything they'd survived together. "Not just for what you did today, but for who you are. For the strength and grace and determination that make you the most remarkable woman I've ever known." "I love you too," she replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." As they held each other in the clear Colorado air, surrounded by the land they had fought to keep and the life they had chosen to build together, Annabeth marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come west as a desperate woman, seeking security through marriage, but had found something far more valuable. She had found herself. The woman who had stepped off the train in Copper Creek would never have faced down a charging bull, or negotiated with a bank examiner, or sacrificed priceless heirlooms to save a ranch. But that woman had been constrained by expectations and limitations that no longer applied. The woman she had become, the woman Beau had seen in her from the beginning, was capable of anything. That evening, as they worked together to prepare dinner for the ranch hands, who had waited anxiously all day for news of their fate, Annabeth reflected on the true meaning of partnership. It wasn't just about sharing work or splitting responsibilities. It was about becoming something greater together than either could be alone. "The men want to know if their jobs are safe," Mrs. Chen reported as she helped serve the meal. "Tell them yes," Beau replied. "Tell them we're not going anywhere." As the ranch hands received the good news with obvious relief and celebration, Annabeth felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal triumph and everything to do with shared responsibility. These men depended on the ranch for their livelihoods, and by fighting to save it, she and Beau had protected not just their own dreams, but the security of everyone who worked alongside them. Later that night, as they lay in their bed listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening quiet, Beau traced gentle patterns on her shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that telegram had never arrived?" he asked. "If your family's circumstances hadn't changed?" Annabeth considered the question seriously. "I think we would have found our way to each other eventually. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe we would have been more cautious, but the connection between us that was real from the beginning. The telegram just forced us to acknowledge it sooner." "No regrets about the jewelry?" She smiled in the darkness. "The only regret I have is that I waited so long to realize that some things are worth fighting for, and some sacrifices aren't really sacrifices at all. They're investments in the future you want to create." "What kind of future do you want to create?" he asked softly. "The kind where love is measured not by pretty words or expensive gifts, but by the willingness to stand together when things get difficult. The kind where children grow up understanding that real strength comes from commitment and hard work, and caring about something bigger than yourself." She turned in his arms to face him. "The kind where two people who started as strangers become partners in every sense of the word." "That sounds like a future worth building," Beau said, his voice rough with emotion. "Then let's build it," she replied, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of hope and determination and love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. Outside their window, the Colorado night stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, holding infinite possibilities for the life they would create together on the foundation they had fought so hard to preserve. The ranch was secure, their partnership was unshakable, and their future stretched ahead, filled with promise and purpose, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you found exactly where you belong. 6 months later, Annabeth stood in the nursery that Beau had built with his own hands, cradling their newborn son, while watching the sunrise paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and rose. The baby Thomas, named for Beau's father, slept peacefully in her arms, his tiny fist curled against her breast with the absolute trust that only the very young possess. The room was simple but beautiful, furnished with pieces that Beau had crafted during the long winter evenings while Annabeth's pregnancy progressed. The cradle was carved from local pine and polished to a warm honey color, decorated with simple designs that spoke of love and patience and the hope for generations to come. A rocking chair sat by the window, positioned to catch the morning light and provide a perfect view of the ranch lands that would someday belong to this child. "He's beautiful," Beau said softly from the doorway, his voice filled with the wonder that had characterized his demeanor since Thomas's birth 3 days earlier. The giant cowboy, who had once seemed so formidable and self-contained, had been reduced to tender amazement by the sight of his son. "He has your stubborn chin," Annabeth observed with a smile, shifting the baby so Beau could see his face. "And I suspect he's going to have your determination, judging by how vigorously he protests when he's hungry." Beau crossed the room and settled beside them in the second chair. He'd built a larger one, designed to accommodate his frame, while still allowing him to be close to his wife and child. His massive hand was infinitely gentle as he touched the baby's soft cheek. "I never imagined," he said quietly, "that something this small could change everything so completely." Annabeth understood exactly what he meant. In the months since their financial crisis, their partnership had deepened into something that felt unshakable. They had faced the challenges of her pregnancy together, from the morning sickness that had made ranch work difficult in the early months, to the anxiety of childbirth in a place where the nearest doctor was a day's ride away. Through it all, they had supported each other with the kind of unwavering commitment that made their original marriage arrangement seem like ancient history. The ranch had prospered under their joint management. The new loan terms negotiated with her grandmother's jewelry as collateral had given them breathing room to expand carefully and systematically. They had purchased additional grazing land, improved their breeding stock, and established relationships with buyers that ensured steady profits even when market prices fluctuated. More importantly, they had created a true home. The house now bore the marks of feminine influence: curtains at the windows, flowers in the garden, music in the evenings when Annabeth played piano, while Beau worked on the books or carved furniture for their growing family. Mrs. Chen had embraced her role as surrogate grandmother, fussing over both the pregnant Annabeth and now the newborn with equal devotion. "The men are asking when you'll be ready to resume full duties," Beau said, though his tone suggested he was in no hurry to see her return to the demanding physical work of ranch life. "Soon," she replied. "Mrs. Chen is perfectly capable of managing the house and the baby for a few hours each day, while I help with the account books and correspondence. And I want to be involved in the decisions about the new grazing land." It was typical of their relationship that even the arrival of their first child hadn't changed the fundamental dynamic of partnership they had established. Annabeth had no intention of retreating to purely domestic concerns, just as Beau had no expectation that she should. They had built their marriage on the principle of shared responsibility and mutual respect, and that foundation remained solid even as their family grew. A soft knock on the nursery door interrupted their quiet conversation. Mrs. Chen appeared with a breakfast tray, her weathered face creased in the perpetual smile that had characterized her demeanor since Thomas's arrival. "Eat," she said firmly, setting the tray on a small table beside the rocking chair. "Baby needs strong mama." As Annabeth ate the simple but nourishing meal Mrs. Chen had prepared, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that desperate morning when she'd stepped off the train in Copper Creek. The refined Eastern lady who had married a stranger out of financial necessity had been transformed into a frontier woman who could manage a ranch, face down charging bulls, and give birth to her child with the assistance of only a Chinese housekeeper and her devoted husband. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had been authentic in a way her previous life had never been. Every skill she'd learned, every challenge she'd overcome, every decision she'd made had been driven by genuine need and purpose rather than social expectation or family obligation. "What are you thinking about?" Beau asked, noting her contemplative expression. "How strange it is that losing everything I thought I wanted led me to find everything I actually needed," she replied. "If my family's business hadn't failed, if I hadn't been forced into that marriage arrangement, I would probably be sitting in some Philadelphia parlor right now, married to a man who valued me for my accomplishments in watercolors and French conversation. And would you have been happy?" She considered the question seriously, looking down at the sleeping baby in her arms and then out the window at the vast landscape that had become her domain. "I thought I would be, but I would have been living someone else's definition of happiness, not my own. I would never have discovered what I was actually capable of." The morning progressed with the comfortable routine they had established in the days since Thomas's birth. Beau handled the ranch operations that required his physical presence while staying close enough to help with the baby when needed. Annabeth managed correspondence and financial matters from the nursery, proving that even the demands of new motherhood couldn't entirely separate her from the business she had helped build. Jake Morrison stopped by at midday, with reports on the cattle and questions about feed supplies for the coming winter. He had long since stopped being surprised by Annabeth's involvement in ranch management, but his easy acceptance of her authority spoke volumes about how completely she had established herself as Beau's equal partner. "That new grazing land looks even better than we hoped," he reported. "Good water, plenty of grass, and natural windbreaks that will make winter easier on the cattle." "What about the access roads?" Annabeth asked, bouncing Thomas gently as he began to fuss. "Will we need significant improvements before we can move herds efficiently?" "Some work needed, but nothing we can't handle with the crew we have," Jake replied. "Should be ready for spring operations." As Jake left and the afternoon settled into the peaceful rhythm of ranch life, Annabeth found herself thinking about the future she and Beau were creating together. Thomas would grow up on this land, learning to ride and rope and manage cattle, but he would also learn to read and cipher and understand the business aspects of ranching. If they were blessed with daughters, those girls would learn both domestic skills and practical management, prepared to be partners rather than ornaments in their own future marriages. The sun was setting behind the western mountains when Beau returned from his final check of the day. He found Annabeth in the kitchen, Thomas sleeping in a basket beside her while she helped Mrs. Chen prepare dinner. The sight of his wife working competently alongside the older woman, their easy coordination speaking of months of shared labor, filled him with profound contentment. "How was your day?" Annabeth asked, looking up from the bread she was slicing. "Productive. The new bull is settling in well with the herd, and the repairs to the south fence are nearly complete." He washed his hands at the pump beside the back door, then moved to peer into the basket where his son slept. "How was Thomas?" "Perfect, of course. He slept most of the afternoon, ate enthusiastically when awakened, and charmed Mrs. Chen completely by gripping her finger during his bath. They sat down to dinner together, the simple, satisfying meal of people who had worked hard and earned their rest. The conversation ranged over ranch business, plans for the coming season, and observations about their son's development that would have seemed absurdly detailed to anyone who wasn't utterly besotted with their first child. Later, as they sat together in the nursery while Thomas had his evening meal, Beau surprised Annabeth by producing a small wrapped package from his shirt pocket. "What's this?" she asked, accepting the gift with curiosity. "Something I had made in town. Open it." Inside the paper wrapping was a simple gold locket, beautifully crafted but without elaborate decoration. When she opened it, she found 2 tiny spaces for photograph zone, already containing a small image of Beau, the other waiting for a picture of their son. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth gold surface. "I thought you might like to have something to replace the jewelry you sacrificed for the ranch," Beau said quietly. Nothing as valuable or elaborate as your grandmother's pieces, but something that represents our life together instead of your life before. The simple gift moved her more than the most expensive diamond necklace could have. It represented not just his love, but his understanding of who she had become and what mattered to her now. "Help me put it on," she requested, turning so he could fasten the chain around her neck. As his fingers worked to fasten the delicate chain around her neck, Annabeth felt the symbolic weight of the gesture. The diamonds and emeralds of her past had been beautiful but cold, representing wealth and status that belonged to someone else's definition of success. This simple locket, warm from his hands and chosen with such thoughtful care, represented something far more precious, a love built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the daily choice to build something meaningful together. "Perfect," Beau murmured as the locket settled against her throat. That night, after Thomas had been fed and settled in his cradle, Annabeth and Beau sat together on their bedroom window seat, looking out over the moonlit landscape that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. The ranch was quiet except for the gentle sounds of cattle settling for the night and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods that lined the creek. "Do you remember what you said to me in church that day?" Annabeth asked, her head resting against Beau's shoulder. "About wanting a fighter who would cook and love and bear sons." "I remember," he said softly. "I also remember thinking I was asking for the impossible. Did you get what you wanted?" He was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her as he considered the question. "I got something better," he said finally. "I got a woman who fights beside me instead of for me, who cooks because she understands that feeding your family is an act of love, and who gave me a son while becoming my equal partner in every way that matters." "And I got something I didn't even know I wanted," Annabeth replied. "A man who saw strength in me before I saw it in myself, who challenged me to become more than I thought possible, and who loves me not, despite my stubborn independence, but because of it." They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in reflection on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. Outside, the Colorado night stretched endlessly under its canopy of stars, holding the promise of countless tomorrows, filled with work and laughter, challenges and triumphs, the daily joys and sorrows of a life lived fully and with purpose. Thomas stirred in his cradle, making the small sounds that meant he would soon wake for another feeding. As Annabeth rose to tend to him, she caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the refined Eastern lady who had arrived in Copper Creek nearly a year ago. Her skin was sun-touched and healthy, her hands capable and strong, her eyes bright, with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you belong. "Sometimes I wonder what that telegram really changed," she mused as she lifted her son from his cradle. "Would we have found our way to this same place without that moment of crisis?" "Maybe," Beau said, joining her beside the cradle, "but I'm grateful we didn't have to find out. I'm grateful for every challenge that forced us to choose each other over and over again until the choosing became as natural as breathing." As Thomas settled into his mother's arms and began his meal with the earnest concentration of the very young, Annabeth reflected on the profound truth of Beau's words. Love, she had learned, wasn't just a feeling that happened to you, it was a decision you made every day, through both smooth seasons and difficult ones. It was choosing to see the best in your partner, even when they were struggling, choosing to work together toward shared goals, even when you disagreed on methods, choosing to build something larger than yourself, even when it required sacrifice. "What do you see when you look at Thomas?" she asked Beau, who was watching their son with the rapt attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Possibility," he said immediately. "The chance to raise a child who understands that real strength comes from taking care of the people and things you love, that work has dignity when it serves a purpose, and that the most important legacy you can leave is the example of how to live with integrity and compassion. He'll grow up knowing that his parents chose each other every day." Annabeth added, "that marriage isn't just about romance or convenience, but about partnership and commitment and the willingness to keep growing together no matter what life brings." As the night deepened around them, They settled into the peaceful routine of new parents, feeding, changing, soothing, and marveling at the tiny miracle they had created together. When Thomas finally settled back into sleep, they returned to their own bed with the bone-deep satisfaction of people who had found their true calling in life. "I love you, Annabeth Rawlins," Beau whispered in the darkness, his voice carrying all the wonder and gratitude of a man who had been given far more than he had dared to hope for. "I love you too, Beau Rawlins," she replied, her fingers finding the simple locket at her throata, tangible reminder of the beautiful life they had built from the most unlikely beginning. Outside their window, the ranch continued its eternal rhythm under the vast Colorado sky. Cattle grazed in moonlit pastures, horses dozed in the corral, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate with wild, joyful abandon. It was the sound of creatures who belonged completely to their environment, who had found their place in the world and claimed it without apology. As sleep claimed them both, Annabeth's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for the courage to step off that train in Copper Creek, for the wisdom to see strength disguised as hardship, and for the grace to recognize love when it came dressed as a challenge rather than a comfort. She had come west, seeking survival, and had found something infinitely more precious. She had found herself, her purpose, and the partner who would walk beside her through all the adventures still to come. The future stretched ahead of them, like the endless prairie full of uncertainty, but bright with promise, demanding but rewarding, challenging but ultimately perfect for two people who had learned that the best things in life were always worth fighting for.